M.Tech Researchers Forum for, I hope I'm heard properly.
Yes, very much, sir.
Okay. So, and thanks also to M.Tech Researchers Forum for inviting me here. It's a privilege to be among such eminent panels and the chair, of course. Now, the concept note grounds, since my topic is 4GW in cognitive domain, the concept note grounds this theme, the theme of the session, in the notion of fourth generation warfare as conceptualized by William Lind. Talks of blurring of distinction between civil and military domains, involving of non-state actors. A lot of speakers have talked about non-state actors, especially NGOs today, and psychological warfare central to this form of warfare. I prefer to use the term cognitive warfare to psychological warfare for various reasons, which possibly will emerge when I speak. Now, before I go any further, a lot has been said about what is civil society. So the way I look at, I looked at civil society before listening to all the speakers today, was civil society was the complete set of Indian citizens. And I was certainly not looking at civil society as the rogue NGO elements which are using the cognitive domain to, in some harmful manner. So I was not looking at civil society as represented by that rogue NGO elements at all. And that is how I still look at it. I would look at those rogue NGO elements as enemy agents in the hands of adversary states who are carrying out cognitive operations against India. So that's the way perspective at which I look civil society. Now, warfare has been conducted in the cognitive domain. It's not a new phenomenon. General Narayan spoke about winning, and I think the chair also spoke about winning without war fighting, the three warfare strategy of China, the psychological operations and meso provisions in US IO doctrine. And then again, General Narayan spoke about the reflexive control concept, which primarily, I think, emanated from Russia. They're all different flavors of cognitive domain operations. And in our own, at least the Indian Army doctrine of 2010, as also there's a joint doctrine of perception management and psychological operations, both published in 2010. So they also talk of psychological operations per se. Now, I would like to present my views on today's theme from a somewhat different perspective from what has been so far happening in the earlier sessions. Rather than just trying to work out measures so firstly, I said that I look at civil society as a vulnerable set of Indian citizens which needs to be protected against cognitive onslaught from the adversary. So that's one. And rather than just trying to work on measures to protect our civil society from the cognitive onslaught, this cognitive onslaught which we are talking about, what if we adopt an offensive defense stance and pay back the perpetrator in the same coin? So General Narayan also talked about, can we pay them back in the same coin? So I am starting from that, and that would be one of the focuses of my talk. Now, in this regard, I would like to recall a recent statement made by External Affairs Minister in relation to the role Canada is playing with respect to Khalistani activists. And he said, Newton's law of politics will apply, and it is no longer a world that runs as a one-way street, and that there would be reactions. Now, one might interpret this statement in many ways. So, for example, if adversary states, and I'm looking at essentially China and Pakistan, of course, Ambassador Sybil talked about all the Western news media, etc. We've talked of all the influences from the West also. So suppose there's interference in Manipur and farmers' protest and elections. Why can't we do a similar payback in the same coin to, for example, exploiting societal fault lines in Uyghurs and Xinjiang, Gilgit-Baltistan, Balochistan? Why can't we do that? Tibet. So cognitive warfare across the spectrum of conflict may be fought between two states. So far, there have been different perspectives, mainly as though NGOs are carrying out this warfare against mainstream, against the government or something. But I am looking at it from warfare between two states, either purely in the gray zone or as a prelude to military operations, or even in conjunction with the kinetic means of warfare after the outbreak of conflict, as it is happening in the Ukraine conflict. We see cognitive warfare also happening there. And of course, zero in on the role of the military. In fact, this panel is all of us are from the military. So that's the one thing which I would like to focus on. Now, in this connection, it must be noted that in international law, conventional wars are envisaged to be fought using kinetic means between combatants and are rooted in the notion of sovereignty. You said, well, we are fully aware of that. Justified wars are governed by the UN Charter. If a responsible state is to fight fourth generation of cognitive warfare against another state, it would be expected to adhere to international law. But at this juncture, as it happens, international law is weakly structured to deal with this form of warfare, and I'll be speaking a little bit about this. So, to delve in all these issues, after contextualizing 4GW in 21st century battle space, I'll first cover what 4GW in the cognitive domain entails in terms of conduct and capability development, emphasizing its highly specialized nature and the impact. Of course, I also built in a portion of AI, but General Shukla has already spoken a lot on that. I will also try to relate cognitive domain operations with existing international law and raise some ethical issues as well, if we have to conduct such a warfare as a nation. And finally, I'll touch upon the capabilities of our primary adversaries, just very briefly, and suggest an overview model for strengthening India's posture in the cognitive domain, including, like I said, the role of the armed forces. So before I go any further, I'd like to share a few slides. I hope they do work. Again, it doesn't seem to be. Let me see. Okay. I think it should work. Yeah, I think it's come up now.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Good. Okay. That's the one technical difficulty one is always concerned about. So anyway, 4GW, I think it was already covered in the opening remarks. One thing which I would like to point out is, if you're, it's from first to fourth, there has been an increasing disorder in the battle space as the generations move from the first to the fourth. Now, because of its inherent characteristics, cognitive warfare is an important component of 4GW. Of course, 4GW comprises of many other measures. Lind's terminology of 4GW is no longer in popular use. It's a little oldish technology, but strong correlations may be found between 4GW and the relatively new notions of hybrid warfare and gray zone warfare. Now, in general, all warfare waged by a state is a whole of nation endeavor carried out by leveraging comprehensive national power, and the dying paradigm, which is depicted in the slide, I'm sure all of us are aware of this, nicely captures the main elements of comprehensive national power. Here, the military element is, of course, the kinetic operations, while the other three, diplomatic, information, and economic realms, are non-kinetic in flavor. And because of the increased effectiveness of non-kinetic operations, new terms have been coined for the synergetic employment of kinetic and non-kinetic means of warfare, such as hybrid warfare, which was invented from the US, unrestricted warfare, referred to by China, and new generation warfare by Russia. And cognitive operations are a very potent means of warfare within the information element of comprehensive national power. Now, another point to be noted is, while hybrid warfare spans the entire spectrum of conflict, gray zone warfare encompasses all means adopted by state and non-state actors in the operational space between peace and all-out conflict to achieve the same politico-military objectives. And we've really been talking about gray zone operations so far in the sessions which we've witnessed. Now, another important point is, while non-kinetic operations, particularly cognitive operations, have greater relevance in the gray zone, while kinetic operations are more effective during all-out conflicts. However, there's a role for both forms of warfare across the full spectrum of conflict. Now, Again, I'll repeat that a state may carry out cognitive operations against an adversary state. So I'm only talking of state-on-state conflicts, independently using multiple agencies at its disposal, or as a component of multi-domain operations in support of military objectives. Now, this is not the real theme, but I'll just touch upon very briefly on cognitive operations in the military context. We refer to multi-domain operations conducted in a five-dimensional battle space, as depicted on the slide. In this five dimensions, cyberspace has to be understood in its wider sense as infospace, encompassing both the cognitive as well as the electromagnetic domains within this. So that's how this five-dimensional this thing should be looked at. Now, cognitive operations in the military context include several conceptually different capabilities. PSYOPs, public information, General Chauhan, of course, has been ADGPI, military deception, military diplomacy, civil military operation. Now, there are several conceptually different subdisciplines in the military context. I would like to dwell on the synergetic use of cyber and cognitive operations, which is referred to in the literature as cyber influence operations, which are relevant for operations in the military context as also against societies as a whole, which is central to the theme of today's session, where we are saying civil societies as the frontier of war. Now, in colloquial terminology, CIO, cyber influence operations, are generally referred to as disinformation campaigns or narrative wars carried out over social media. Of course, we've been focusing on through NGOs, but now I'm talking of cyber influence operations. So there, we see that social media becomes prominent, and of course, social media has come up through several speakers today. Now, there is much more to CIO than this restricted understanding. CIO is a complex confluence of cyber and cognitive operations. As emphasized here, that not all CIO require the use of specialist cyber expertise. Some merely use cyberspace as a medium, for example, dissemination of preferred narratives through social media platforms, requiring expertise only in the art of generating narratives. Others require cyber operations expertise as well. For example, Cambridge Analytica type of operation, where Facebook profiles are first hacked and thereafter targeted messages sent. So, and from terminology wise, the former, which don't require cyber expertise, are referred to as social influence operations, and the latter are referred to as technical influence operations, the ones which require cyber expertise. There's so much about terminology theory, but I just wanted to bring out the synergy between cyber and influence operations. Now, CIO involve a host of complex techniques and stratagems. Stratagems being a combination of techniques to achieve a certain effect, mostly underpinned by social science disciplines such as psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, sociology, which need to be mastered. Some of the more significant techniques and stratagem, of course, I've listed on the slide, and maybe I could elaborate if time permits during the Q&A. I would like to highlight, however, that CIO are very complex in nature, requiring highly specialist expertise, both in cyber as well as cognitive disciplines, and establishing the right organizations and HR policies, therefore, are key to the success for the conduct of CIO, which are in turn a very important component of cognitive operations. Now, as far as impact of AI on cognitive operations is concerned, Jan Shukla, like I said, has already covered very extensively. Deepfakes, AI-powered bots, micro-targeting and personalization, generative AI. Jan Shukla talked about ChatGPT. So generative AI and large language models, these are technical names for ChatGPT. And the impact could be on undermining political stability, interference in electoral processes, very important thing. As General Bakshi in the morning pointed out, still it's already ongoing as far as our electoral process is concerned. Economic destabilization and distorted perceptions of reality. This last I would like to elaborate a little. The convergence of disinformation campaigns and generative AI has given rise to what scholars refer to as the liar's dividend. It was in passing mentioned by one of the speakers, a phenomenon where the proliferation of falsehoods erodes trust in information sources and distorts reality, and have a severe impact on governance and security. I think General Shukla elaborated on this part too. Now I will talk next about ethical and legal issues, something which has not really been addressed very much so far. Now, if a nation, I'm talking on now, retortion, uh, uh, doing the same, paying back in the same coin, adopting cognitive warfare against an adversary state in lines with other lines of effort. So, firstly, some ethical issues come up if a nation has to adopt this approach. Firstly, freedom of press. The question comes up, in the interests of national security, should a certain degree of control be exerted by a state over broadcast media? For example, in the Ukraine conflict, even the so-called liberal West has exhibited no qualms in exerting a great degree of control over the media in banning, for example, RT and Sputnik. Most recent example being Israel banning RT. And of course, Ambassador Civil in the morning talked about what the Western press, how negatively it is oriented towards India per se. So he very greatly stressed that point. Then next, PSYOP against domestic audiences. With respect to domestic audiences, the ethical question which needs to be addressed is, should half-truths also, and lies ever be systematically fed to domestic audiences, even in the interest of national security? Surprisingly, if you look at our IDS perception management doctrine, it says PSYOPs carried out under domestic audiences, but I think that's just a incorrect usage of terminology. It didn't really mean half-truths and lies. I don't think it meant that. Then cognitive warfare against adversary populations. There also there is ethics involved. Disseminating disinformation amongst an adversary population might potentially lead to violent protests and even deaths. So should disinformation be countered with truthful narratives alone, which is what liberal democracies try to project, but really don't follow on ground? Or would there be a losing defensive strategy? So if, for example, China or Pakistan are doing something against us, should we just be countering it with truthful information? Alternatively, should a more offensive stance be adopted, even if it harms innocent civilians? So that's a question which, as a nation, we have to address and go one way or the other, depending on what we want to do on the which view we take on the ethical front. So much about ethics. A little bit on cognitive warfare vis-a-vis international law. Now, this is an aspect which is less discussed. So while discussions have been ongoing in various international fora for over 2 decades on how international law applies in cyberspace, incidentally without much progress, there have been no formal discussions on similar lines as far as cognitive warfare is concerned. However, the following may be stated. While considering the legal justification under international law for the use of force, including kinetic force or any other unfriendly measures against another state, there are 3 thresholds which come into play, which are normally talked about in legal terms. The highest is the threshold of armed conflict or use of force, which is governed by Article 2 and Article 51 of the UN Charter. Basically, you are allowed to use force, kinetic force, in self-defense. That's Article 51. The second level is a violation of the principle of non-intervention. Non-intervention in what? You cannot violate sovereignty, and sovereignty doesn't include only territorial sovereignty, but also any governance function. So if you violate sovereignty with coercion, this is what would be violating this is the principle of non-intervention. It is not, it would be violating the principle of non-intervention. And the lowest level is the violation of just sovereignty without coercion. Now, what are these? So how do you, if let us say an adversary state violates the principle of non-intervention, is it justified for the victim state? So for example, is it justified for us to use what type of measures? The types of measures we can use are what are referred to in legal terms as retortion, which is things like, expelling diplomats and sanctions, and maybe even use cognitive measures, which so far are not considered illegal as far as international law is concerned. So cognitive warfare clearly does not cross the threshold of the use of force. Depending on whether it can be shown whether coercive force has been applied, it might violate the principle of non-intervention. And as far as violation of sovereignty itself is concerned, definitely cognitive warfare violates sovereignty because it is interfering with the governance functions of a state. However, whether we can use retortion in when only sovereignty is violated is an open question in international law. So I hope it is making some sense. These are the three levels which I talked about. They also talked about in cyberspace, in the correction of cyberspace discussions, and they're equally applicable in cognitive space as well. Okay. So, okay. So I think I'll quickly skip it. We're already at 4:25. I think we all know Confucian Institute, Strategic Support Force, Three Warfares, the ISPR of Pakistan. So I'll skip this part. I'll just come to the final part on India's posture. So India's cognitive operations strategy must necessarily be a whole of government approach. Primary agencies are the MOD oblique armed forces, the MEA and RAW, and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. The Ministry of Home Affairs must focus on developing an effective defensive strategy to protect our civilian society, the whole lot of citizens, from onslaught by the adversaries. And being a multi-agency effort, India needs to evolve a potent apex level organization for coordinating all cognitive warfare lines of effort. And a notional architecture is what is depicted here. What about the role of the armed forces? So I would say that as compared to PLA's SSF, which has now been restructured, of course, in three different separate forces, and Pakistan SPR, we are on a weak footing. So structured training of armed forces personnel is required. HR policies have to change. A Tri-Services Defense Cognitive Operations Agency must also be set up on a pilot basis. That's my view. And we need to grapple with the question of whether, since cognitive operations also achieve strategic effects in an adversary state, should the armed forces play a key role in cognitive operations, not just in support of military operations, but across the spectrum of conflict. With that, I conclude. Thanks for your attention.